Were you looking for more ways to give a terrible sermon? Because, if so, you have come to the right place. This is from a list originally by the Reverend Jane Rzepka and the Reverend Ken Sawyer, who wrote the very excellent book, Thematic Preaching, a preaching manual for Unitarian Universalists. Others added to this list. There are a few of my own contributions, some from students in the preaching class at Meadville Lombard Theological School, some from students in the lay preaching class that I've led, based on the Reverend Eric Hewitt's very, very good book, The Shared Pulpit, a 7-session introduction to preaching for folks who haven't preached before. It's real good. All right, truly terrible ways to give a sermon. 1, talk about the trouble you had writing and preparing the sermon. Don't show your work. People don't need to know or care. It's not germane to the point of it. It calls attention to the form. It makes it about you, not about them and the sermon. I'm hard-pressed to think of a situation where it would be relevant to the thing that you're actually talking about, rather than being about you. Tell your friends who are not part of the church that you serve. Tell your spouse or partner or kids or parents, but you don't need to do that in the preaching. 2, we live in a world of change. This last year of pandemic, the cliche is in these uncertain times, in these unprecedented times. Like, yeah, we know. We don't need cliches like that. It's a special kind of cliche that appears to be naming a deep essential truth about like the moment that we're in right now, but it's really just a cliche. Keep your ideas disconnected and let the Holy Spirit connect the dots. A random collage of disconnected things is not a sermon form. Even a collage is a collage of connected things that has a theme, an idea, a thread that runs through it. A sermon is a unified whole, even if it contains different scenes, different stories, different poetry, different whatever it is. It's still a unified whole, and if there is no thread through those things, or if there's no thread that your listeners can discern, you can't just trust that the gaps are going to magically be filled in. Put it together. 5 sermons in 1. I think this is especially true for newer preachers where you are filled with big, good, many ideas that go in lots of different directions and are all fine ideas and fine sermons, but they're sermons with an S on the end, plural. Don't put them all in the same sermon. It turns out that whether it's 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it's actually not very much time at all. I know it probably feels like a huge expanse of blank paper and minutes to fill, but it turns out not to be a ton of time for the number of things that you want to try and put in there. I find it helpful sometimes, too, to remember that you have the whole rest of your life and career to preach all the sermons that might be on your mind. 5, too much information, TMI. Someone told me once, don't ever tell a story in which you, the preacher, are like, I was sitting on the toilet and then this thing happened, because immediately, no matter how good of a story it is, your listeners, your congregation have left the sermon and they are thinking of you on a toilet. So that's too much information. But what else is too much information? Sometimes it depends on context and expectations and norms of the community that you're a part of. But tend to that carefully. Just because you're really comfortable and at ease talking about, say, your relationship life or your sex life or something, like your own personal comfort with it doesn't mean that it's not maybe still TMI. You always have one eye on how is this going to land with your listeners. 6, bring people into the valley, but not out again. Meaning, part of the task not every Sunday, but regularly enough, is to face the difficult realities of the world, to name the reality of evil, of suffering, without any discernible higher purpose to it. I mean, there's so much broken in this world. You got to take people there. You can't pretend that everything's fine. It's not just a feel-good, sunny, optimistic faith. Everything's cheerful. We are not an Easter faith without Good Friday. On the other hand, we're also not a Good Friday faith without Easter. Don't take people into the valley of the shadow of death and then leave them there. That's not what happens in the psalm. So don't bring them down and not back out again. That doesn't mean bring them out with, half-truths and bland assurances. Global sea levels are going to rise and wipe entire nations from the face of the earth. But it's okay. Go recycle. Yeah, go recycle, but you did not just bring them out of the valley by inviting them to go recycle. Alienate people by using words that exclude. There's so many I think, college-educated, upper-class Unitarian Universalists. We disbelievers in a higher power. That's not exactly right, but you get the joke. Who belongs? Who belongs in your congregation? Who belongs in your congregation is not the same as who is in your congregation right now. I don't know, maybe by some fluke you have a congregation of somehow exclusively college-educated, upper-class Unitarians. I don't think that exists anymore. But maybe. Even so, those people are not who the congregation is for. Because we're Universalists. So you got to guard that language, and that stuff can sneak in really, really easily. I'm sure I've done some of this. I was thinking about this in one of the earlier lists of ways to preach terribly. I think I said something like, don't preach or don't. What did I do? I said something like, if you say that you're welcoming to queer folks and never talk about them, you're not really welcoming, which is a true statement, but also implicitly, certainly can be understood to draw a circle in which we are not queer folks. They are queer folks. Alienate people by using words that exclude. I may well have done that. So you got to pay attention to that. How's that stuff going to land with your listeners? Ignore feedback. Feedback is a complicated beast. Ignore feedback is not the same as pay attention to all the feedback you receive. Listen to all the feedback you receive. Ignore all the feedback that throws you under the bus, and ignore all the feedback that praises you. Listen for the thing that's underneath that. Listen for the nugget of wisdom. Don't pay any attention. For the most part, it's very, very rare I've ever received a useful piece of feedback in a receiving line. I pay attention to feedback that comes up in the way the board talks about worship, that comes up in whether the committee on ministry, when they're talking about a certain topic, remembers that we touched on that. Feedback comes in lots of different forms. Just because people give you feedback doesn't mean that it's right. Just because people give you feedback doesn't mean you need to pay attention to it. But on the other hand, you also can't ignore it. I am resolutely steering us into this contradiction. I think most important is to cultivate your inner voice and sense of feedback also. Part of that is, again, the physicist Richard Feynman says, the most important thing is not to fool yourself, and you are the easiest person in the world to fool. You are the easiest person in the world for you to fool. So the work is, how do you not get fooled? How do you not get fooled with praise? How do you not get fooled with negative feedback? And most of all, how do you stay true to your call and to making space to say a true word rather than chasing feedback? Make sure you use popular references that no one understands. We no longer live in a world with a shared cultural repertoire, if that even was a thing that existed in the past. There is no TV show that everyone's watched. There is no book that everyone's read, no periodical that everyone subscribes to. That simply does not exist. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use popular references, but popular references are jargon unless they are explained, accessible, and you're inviting people into them. One of the best things I ever heard was a student telling a story from the cartoon show Adventure Time. I know of Adventure Time. I don't know. I haven't watched it or anything. But so quickly and simply and warmly, and with a keen sense of the silliness, but also the seriousness of the topic, in less than 4 sentences. It's like 3.5 sentences. They said what the show was, who the key character they were going to talk about was. They got the flavor of what that experience of watching the show was like, sort of wonder, whimsy, and serious stuff too, like all woven together. And then they went in to tell the story. And great, that was as much table setting as they needed. But they didn't just say, so on an episode of Adventure Time, so-and-so, like, because they would have lost almost all of the room there. It was so elegantly and briefly done, using as few possible words as they could, but inviting people into it. So again, when I say make sure you use, when I say don't use popular references no one understands, it doesn't mean don't use them ever, but you need to invite your listeners into them and make them make sense for them. If you have more ways to give a truly terrible sermon, I'd love to hear them. Feel free to add comments down below.